I think the fact that President Trump first trip overseas was to visit with the leaders of 50 Arab nations, and then went to Israel. And then a short time after that, made the decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. What not only Israel saw and the American people saw, but Arab nations in the region saw, is that America stands with Israel.
The president telling the heads of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinians today he will recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. An unprecedented move, breaking with U.S. policy since Israel was created.
1995, Congress adopted the Jerusalem Embassy Act, urging the federal government to relocate the American embassy to Jerusalem. This act passed Congress by an overwhelming bipartisan majority. Every previous American president has exercised the law's waiver. Presidents issued these waivers under the belief that delaying the recognition of Jerusalem would advance the cause of peace. Nevertheless, the record is in. After more than 2 decades of waivers, we are no closer to a lasting peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. It would be folly to assume that repeating the exact same formula would now produce a different or better result.
The president made a very gutsy decision to move the embassy, even though it was obviously American law and something that previous presidents had promised. One Arab leader said to me, "Look, I'm not going to tell you to move the embassy, and I'm not going to tell you not to move the embassy, but what I will tell you is that if you decide to do it, you'll find out who your friends are." There was a lot of jockeying outside, people trying to scare the president out of doing it.
There has been condemnation of President Trump's move across the globe. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas said the announcement could lead to wars that never end.
The State Department tonight warning embassies around the world to be alert for violence.
I get asked occasionally, what do I think was the most important thing that the Trump administration did along the way? I always refer to the embassy move. You were in the CIA then?
Yes. We provided our best analysis. It too was rooted in a legacy history predictive of bad things happening, of real risk, not only in the Middle East, right? We were concerned about what might happen in a place like Pakistan, or a place that might happen in Jakarta. Lots of places that there was real risk that had been identified by the national security apparatus. And President Trump said, fine, prepare, do the right thing, get that piece right. We want to keep everyone safe and lay the groundwork for this. We don't want to create the conditions for violence.
How do you see the significance of the embassy move?
Yeah, it was the fulcrum. And it was the launch pad at the same time. So it was both a lever and a rocket. In the sense of, it did demonstrate that President Trump was serious about living up to the campaign promises that he had made.
Making Jerusalem the capital of Israel was such a big thing for every president, and then they got in, they wouldn't do it. I understand why, by the way, and I've told it many times, where why wouldn't they do it? And then you get in and you have every country calling, saying, please don't do that, please don't do that, you can't do that. And this happened to many other presidents, many other presidents. They'd campaign about the capital of Israel, and it was going to be Jerusalem. They were going to do it right away, and then they never did it. There was tremendous pressure put on them, and I just turned off the telephones and I got it done.
After World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the newly formed League of Nations granted a mandate to Great Britain for the territory called Palestine, a vast expanse of land that today includes Jordan and Israel. The mandate for Palestine includes fostering political, administrative, and economic conditions that would enable independent rule of the area's territory. After World War II, the League of Nations was replaced with the United Nations. At the request of Great Britain, one of the UN's very first tasks was to aid in the formation of an Arab and a Jewish state within Palestine. In In 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution known as the Partition Plan, recommending the creation of an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state. Israel accepted the Partition Plan. The Arab nations all rejected it. Upon the termination of the British mandate that ended at midnight on May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence and reaffirmed Jerusalem as its capital. Forces from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon immediately attacked the new nation. Although Israel won its war for independence, Jordanian forces occupied the eastern part of Jerusalem, containing the historic Jewish Quarter, the Temple Mount, and the Western Wall. Jerusalem remained divided for 19 years, and during that time, Jews were not permitted to enter the eastern part of the city. Then, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem. Every prime minister since has declared the city the eternal and undivided capital of the Jewish state. The United States has said the same thing since passage of the Jerusalem Embassy Act in 1995. Although Israel asserted sovereignty over all of Jerusalem since 1967, Israel has permitted open access to all of the Abrahamic faiths to worship at their respective holy sites. Just before the Trump administration took office, the prior administration permitted the United Nations to pass a resolution declaring, among other things, that Israel was illegally occupying eastern Jerusalem, the area that Israel had captured in the 1967 war. That resolution was rejected by Israel and many American leaders of both political parties.
A strong message from the international community to the United States. Jerusalem cannot be recognized as Israel's capital.
3,000 years ago, King David declared the city of Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people. Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The Jewish people were exiled from Jerusalem, but the connection between Jerusalem and the Jewish people was never broken. It will never be broken. Not by the Romans, not by the Babylonians, not by the Ottoman Turks, not by the British Empire, and not by the United Nations.
At an emergency session at the UN, 128 countries voted in favor of a resolution to effectively make US President Donald Trump's decision on Jerusalem null and void.
There was also an attack at him from the conventional thinking, which is, if you're going to give this big concession to Israel, why aren't you getting something for it? And what people didn't realize, and what President Trump understood, is that he was getting something for it. He was building credibility in the region by showing that when he makes a promise, he's going to deliver his promise. And that gave him maneuverability and the credibility to do different things down the road.
The Arab states, and not just the Arab states in this region, but countries around the world, understand that there is a unique relationship between Israel and the United States. When there is no daylight in that relationship, when the United States is embracing Israel, that sends a very powerful message to the states without the region.
My heart for Israel comes from my faith, but it also comes from my heart as an American. Love for Israel echoes out of every little buckboard church along every little highway and byway across the heartland. I think the fact that President Trump first trip overseas was to visit with the leaders of 50 Arab nations, and then went to Israel. And then a short time after that, made the decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. What not only Israel saw and the American people saw, but Arab nations in the region saw, is that America stands with Israel, but that America is also prepared to stand with Arab nations of goodwill.
The United States has long-standing allies among the Arab nations, with many goals and values in common. Even in these relationships, a recurring sticking point has often been disagreement surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I went to meet with the Palestinians and with their negotiators, and what I very quickly came to realize is I pulled all the documents. I wanted to see what they'd agreed on or not agreed on in the past. I was trying to scope out the deal. What I realized is nothing's changed in the deal in the last 25 years.
In 2002, there was an Arab Peace Initiative. In those years, there were people who were going on around the world saying the single greatest problem in the Middle East, if not the whole world, was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so people for a very long time were focused on that as being central to change in the Middle East.
The framework that we used the entire time was, if we come up with this conclusion, will this make Israel more safe? And will this make the Palestinian people have the opportunity to live a better life? And if the answer was yes to both, we thought that was the proper compromise.
Thank you for joining us as we provide a spiritual insight of what God is doing in Israel and in the Middle East. If you want to learn more about what God is doing in Israel, make sure to visit us on our webpage and follow us on social media. Shalom, and God bless you from Jerusalem.